had always been a fan of the outdoors. There was something about being out in the wilderness that made me feel more alive, more at peace with myself. So when I had the chance to take a weekend camping trip in a remote part of the forest, I jumped at the opportunity. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, and enjoy a quiet weekend under the stars. I didn't think anything could go wrong. After all, it was just a weekend, and I'd done this many times before. I arrived at the campsite just after noon, feeling excited and ready for the adventure. The sun was high in the sky, the air crisp and clean. The forest was quiet, with just the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. It felt perfect, like I had entered some kind of sanctuary. I had chosen this spot because it was secluded. There weren't any other campers nearby, which meant I could enjoy the peace and quiet without interruption. I found a small clearing near a stream where I could set up my tent. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and I felt a sense of satisfaction as I unpacked my gear. The first few hours went by smoothly. I set up my tent, built a fire pit, and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I had everything ready. The fire crackled to life, sending sparks into the evening sky, and I sat back on a rock, watching the flames dance. As darkness settled in, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. There were no other sounds except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind. It was unnerving in a way. I was used to the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant animals. But here, in this part of the forest, everything was still. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the stillness of the night. I wasn't used to being out in the woods alone, but I had done it before. I was used to solitude. Besides, it was peaceful, wasn't it? I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and roasted marshmallows, sitting by the fire and watching the stars appear one by one in the sky. It was beautiful, almost magical, how clear the night sky was. I hadn't seen the stars like this in years. As the night deepened, the air grew cooler. I wrapped myself in a blanket and leaned back, staring up at the constellations. For a moment, I felt completely at ease, like everything in my life had fallen into place. But that feeling didn't last long. Something shifted in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I stood up and stretched, my muscles stiff from sitting too long. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was strange, too deliberate, too close. My heart started to race as I listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees stretching out in the moonlight. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. "You're being paranoid." I returned to my seat by the fire, trying to convince myself that there was no reason to be afraid. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. It was as if the woods had grown darker, more oppressive. The rustling came again, this time louder. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the woods behind me, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shined it toward the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. No animal, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I quickly began packing up my gear, deciding to move the camp further away from whatever was making that noise. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing in on me. The trees seemed to loom over me, casting long, twisted shadows. As I hurried to pack, I heard the sound again, much closer this time. It wasn't just rustling, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking just beyond the reach of the light. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and started walking quickly toward the trailhead. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of there. The path to the trailhead was narrow, winding through the trees. I tried to keep my pace steady, but my legs felt like lead, and my heart was thudding in my chest. Every rustle, every crack of a twig underfoot made me jump. I glanced behind me, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel the presence of someone nearby. I quickened my pace, trying to put as much distance between myself and the camp as possible. But the path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like a tunnel. I reached the trailhead, where I'd parked my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest, as if nothing had ever happened. I got into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, my mind still racing. What had I heard? Was it just my imagination? Or had someone been out there watching me? I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. The drive back home felt like an eternity, the road winding through the forest with the headlights cutting through the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. My mind kept replaying the events of the night over and over again, but I couldn't make sense of it. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring out into the darkness. The silence of the woods seemed to follow me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something in those woods that I'll never understand. But whatever it was, it's a memory that stays with me to this day. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot in the woods. There are some places that stay with you, no matter how hard you try to forget them. And sometimes it's better to leave certain questions unanswered. The forest was silent, save for the occasional crackling of the campfire. I stared at the flames, watching them dance like 1,000 orange snakes, twisting and writhing in the night air. My breath hung in the cold, crisp air, and my hands were already numb despite the gloves I'd worn. The fire wasn't doing much to fight off the chill, but it felt good to have it there, as if it somehow gave me a sense of comfort, even though I knew better. Comfort is a luxury out here, and I wasn't foolish enough to rely on it for too long. The first night camping alone always feels a bit strange, no matter how many times you've done it. Something about the stillness, the way the trees loom over you, and the way the shadows stretch unnaturally, makes you feel small. I'd been on plenty of solo trips before, but this was different. This was the first time I'd come out to this particular forest, Blackwood Pines. The kind of place where people disappear every year, although no one seems to want to talk about it. Not that it's on any missing persons lists or anything official like that. It's the kind of thing you just hear murmurs about, from old-timers and anxious campers who come back with pale faces and jittery hands. I'd brushed it off, of course. The woods are just the woods, right? But even as I sat there, the wind rustling through the dense canopy above me, something didn't sit right. The air had a weight to it, thick and heavy, as though it was holding its breath. Every now and then, the fire would crackle too loudly, making me jump, but I'd quickly brush it off and try to get back into a rhythm. I had plans to go to sleep early, something simple, a good rest before the hike tomorrow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't like the sensation you get when you're on alert, no. this was different. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it wasn't thrilled with my presence. Maybe I was just imagining it. It was late after all. But as the darkness closed in tighter, I couldn't push the thought out of my head. I tried to distract myself. I checked my gear, arranged it a little differently in my tent, and took out my map to trace out the trail I'd be walking in the morning. But nothing helped. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. So I decided to do what anyone would do. I gathered a few more logs for the fire. The sound of the woods, the wind, the occasional owl hoot, the soft rustle of branches continued to be my only company. Then came the first noise. First, it was barely a whisper, a subtle shift in the breeze, or maybe a branch brushing against another. But then it repeated louder this time, a distinct crack, followed by the slow, methodical sound of something moving heavy, like a large animal or a person. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, then began to pound wildly in my chest. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark outline of trees that surrounded my camp. It was impossible to see anything clearly, just shifting shapes and shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, something harmless. The forest was home to wildlife after all. But something about the noise didn't fit. Bears don't make those kinds of steps. It wasn't clumsy or chaotic like an animal on the hunt. It was slow and deliberate, like whatever it was knew exactly what it was doing. The sound came again, closer this time. My fingers tightened around the flashlight I'd set down by the fire, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, not yet. I sat still, straining my ears, hoping that I was wrong, that it was just a trick of the wind or some other benign explanation. But the footsteps kept coming, each one slow, as though someone or something was circling my camp. My stomach twisted, a knot of panic starting to form. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to stand up and shout out, assert my presence. But the other part of me, the smarter part, told me that it was better to stay still, not to alert whatever it was to the fact that I was aware of it. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, my body frozen, listening intently. I didn't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours. Then, another sound broke the silence. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, deep, steady breaths, but loud enough that I could hear them clearly. Coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight, like whoever was out there was standing at the edge of my camp, watching. My heart was in my throat, and I forced myself to stay as quiet as possible. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Whoever or whatever it wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting. I had no idea how much time had passed since that first noise, but my mind was racing. What do I do now? Should I confront it? No, that would be stupid. If it was an animal, it could easily overpower me. If it was someone, then confronting them would put me in an even worse position. But if I didn't do something soon, I'd never know if I was in real danger. I felt a strange compulsion to get up, to grab my pack and run, but something held me in place. I couldn't do it. My body felt like it was glued to the ground, paralyzed by the fear creeping over me. Then I heard it, a voice, a low, guttural sound that wasn't really a voice at all, but more like a moan, a rasping exhale, like someone or something was trying to speak, but couldn't. I couldn't make out any words. The sound was too distorted, too unnatural. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tense. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my hands, but they were shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't hold back any longer. I flicked the beam of light toward the edge of the trees, hoping to see something, anything, out of the ordinary. The beam of light sliced through the darkness. And then, for a brief moment, I saw it. A shape, tall, too tall for a person, with long, gangly limbs and a silhouette that didn't belong in the forest. It was standing just outside the light, hidden mostly in shadow, but I could make out enough to know that it was no animal. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its distorted breathing filling the air. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt dry, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. It didn't make sense. How could it be real? Was I imagining it? No, I wasn't. My instincts were screaming at me to react, to do something, anything to get away. Suddenly, the figure shifted. It moved slowly at first, then faster. It took one step toward the firelight, then another. My body froze, as if it were locked in place by some invisible force. Couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The woods fell into complete silence again, the kind of silence that fills the air with dread. I sat there, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The fire crackled softly, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered enough courage to stand up. I grabbed my pack, my jacket, and the rest of my gear. I didn't even take the time to properly pack everything. There was no time for that. I needed to get out of here and fast. I stumbled over the uneven ground, my legs shaky, as I tried to keep my bearings. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The forest felt oppressive now, every tree seeming to loom over me like silent watchers. The path that had once seemed familiar now felt like a maze, twisting and turning into unknown places. By the time I reached my car, I was breathless, covered in sweat despite the cold. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had no intention of ever returning to Blackwood Pines. Something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. As I drove away, the only thing I could hear was the sound of the engine and the tires on the road. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching me, waiting for my return. The first time I went camping alone, I thought I'd feel free, relaxed, surrounded by nature. I was tired of city life, tired of the noise, the crowds, the constant rush. The plan was simple: pack up my things, head out to the woods, and just enjoy the silence. I had seen people do it in movies, heard people talk about how peaceful it was. I didn't want to be anywhere near others, just me, the trees, and the stars. It was early in the morning when I set out, and by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees. I made my way down the narrow dirt path to the area where I had planned to set up my tent. It was perfect, isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and far enough from the nearest trail that I knew I wouldn't be bothered. The smell of pine and earth filled the air, felt fresh, alive. I threw my backpack down by the clearing and started getting my camp ready. Tent first, then firewood, then the rest. Everything was going according to plan. I spent the first few hours just settling in, cutting some wood for a fire, checking the surroundings, and making sure I knew the area well. The forest wasn't particularly dense where I was, but it had enough trees to give me a sense of seclusion. The ground was soft but firm, not too muddy but not too dry either. I felt comfortable, safe. I lit a small fire just before sunset. The crackling flames seemed to warm the air, and I could hear the sound of birds settling down for the night. As the sun disappeared completely, the temperature dropped. The fire kept me warm, but not entirely. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat on a large rock near the fire, letting the flames light up the space around me. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you don't get in the city, the kind you rarely experience even in nature unless you're far enough away from everything. But then I started hearing things. At first, I brushed it off as the wind. It was a strange kind of wind, though, as if it was shifting in directions that didn't make sense. I could hear the rustling of leaves, but also something else, a faint, distant sound, a cracking like a twig snapping. It wasn't rhythmic, like an animal moving through the forest. No, this was different. I felt a chill run down my spine. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond the light of the fire, trying to pierce through the shadows, but there was nothing. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon, I told myself. Nothing to worry about, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It made my skin crawl. I tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on the fire and the warmth it provided. I pulled out a book, trying to distract myself, but my mind wasn't there. The sounds kept coming, and they weren't random. It felt like something was moving closer, and every now and then, I could hear the sound of something breathing, heavy and slow. My eyes darted around, scanning every tree, every shadow, but there was nothing, just the wind, the crackling fire, and that unsettling feeling. I stood up, hoping to stretch my legs and clear my head. As I walked around the campsite, the sound seemed to stop, but the feeling didn't. It was like the air had thickened, pressing against me, suffocating me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. My mind raced through the possibilities. What if someone else was out there? A hiker, maybe, who had gotten lost. Maybe a camper from a nearby site? But the nearest site was miles away. No one should be out here. I made my way back to the fire, grabbed a stick, and poked at the logs. The flames flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the clearing. That's when I heard it again. A faint snap, followed by that same slow, deliberate breathing. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the firelight, the trees, and the darkness beyond. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the sound had stopped. The forest was silent again, almost too silent. I wanted to laugh, to tell myself I was overreacting, but something told me that laughing wouldn't make it go away. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything I might need into it, and zipped it up. Then I gathered what firewood I had left and tossed it on the fire, hoping that the extra flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. I didn't want to stay in the dark for too long, so I decided to go to bed early. The tent was only a few feet away, and I moved quickly, trying not to let my mind get the best of me. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and lay there in the quiet. I could still hear the sounds of the forest around me, but I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or animals, nothing to worry about. But that wasn't true. I knew that wasn't true. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small sound made my heart race. The rustling of the trees, the cracking of branches, the occasional thud of something hitting the ground. I tried to drown it out by closing my eyes and focusing on my breathing, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched never went away, and every time I thought I heard something, I would freeze, holding my breath, straining to hear. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The night felt longer than it was, but when I woke up, the world outside the tent was eerily still. I waited for the sun to rise, but it seemed to take forever. By the time it did, I felt a little better. The light of the morning cast a sense of calm over everything, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. I didn't even make coffee that morning, just grabbed my stuff and hiked out. But as I walked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the woods. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't fade. The further I got from the campsite, the more I started to feel the weight of the experience lift. By the time I reached the car, the world felt normal again. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back into those woods again. As I drove back towards civilization, I thought about the night. I thought about the noises, the breathing, the eyes that I felt on me even when I couldn't see them. I never figured out what it was. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe something or someone had been watching. But either way, I was glad to leave that forest behind. The silence of the woods had felt peaceful at first, but by the end, it had felt suffocating. And I knew, deep down, that some places are best left unexplored. I've always been the type of person who loved the outdoors. The idea of getting away from everything, breathing in the fresh air, and sleeping under the stars. So when my friends suggested a camping trip up north, I didn't hesitate. It was a weekend thing, just a couple of days to reconnect with nature, disconnect from the chaos of daily life, and enjoy some peace. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. It wasn't too busy. A few tents scattered around, but nothing that felt overwhelming. The air was cool, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle wind. We set up our tents in a small clearing, nestled between two large oak trees. It was a quiet spot, and I immediately felt at ease. I spent some time gathering wood for the fire, while the others got the tent set up and started pulling out gear. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp. The sky slowly turned a deep orange, then a rich purple as the stars began to appear. There's something magical about the wilderness at night, the way it feels both alive and empty at the same time. The sounds of crickets and distant rustling in the trees filled the air. We built a fire and gathered around it, warming our hands and cooking some simple meals. The conversation was light, filled with stories and jokes. But as the fire flickered and crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, but there was an odd silence in the woods, almost like nature itself was holding its breath. The wind had stopped completely, and the usual sounds of wildlife had faded away. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends asked suddenly. We all stopped, our eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling sound came from the trees, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to brush off the feeling. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The night wore on, and the tension in the air didn't let up. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire our only companion. At some point, we all crawled into our tents to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily for me. Every little sound outside made me tense, my mind racing with thoughts of things lurking just beyond the safety of the tent walls. At some point during the night, I woke up to a loud crash, something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself that it was just a bear or some other wild animal. But then there was the sound of something moving around our campsite, stepping slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent, shining the beam toward the trees. The beam of light flickered, the shadows twisting unnaturally, but there was nothing there. My heart settled a little, but the unease remained. The next morning, we all gathered around the campfire again, the events of the night still hanging heavily in the air. No one spoke of the growl, but I could see the same unease in everyone's eyes. We packed up the campsite quickly, eager to get moving and put some distance between us and whatever had caused the disturbance. We decided to take a hike through the woods to clear our heads. The trail was quiet, the only sounds being our footsteps and the occasional bird call. The trees here were dense, the ground uneven, and the air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of pine. We hiked for a few hours, the landscape changing as we went higher up the mountain. The views were incredible. You could see the valley stretching out below us, the river winding through the forest. But the farther we went, the more isolated it felt. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trail narrowing, and the shadows growing longer as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. That's when we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from deep within the trees. It was a scratching noise, like something moving through the underbrush, but it wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, and methodical. We all stopped, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice wavered, betraying the fear creeping into my chest. My friends hesitated, but eventually they followed behind me as I cautiously made my way off the trail, the sound growing louder with each step. I don't know what I expected to find, but it certainly wasn't what I saw. There, just beyond a thicket of bushes, was a small makeshift camp. A fire pit, long since abandoned, sat in the center. Broken branches and scattered clothing were strewn about, as if someone had left in a hurry. But it wasn't the remnants of the camp that unsettled me. It was the marks on the trees surrounding it. Deep gouges, like claw marks, marred the trunks. Some of the marks were so high up that whatever had made them would have had to be standing on two legs. The air felt thick, oppressive, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched crept over me. "We need to go. Now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We turned and hurried back to the main trail, not stopping to look back. The quiet was deafening as we walked, the wind picking up once more, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, sharp. By the time we made it back to the campsite, the sun was setting, casting everything in a blood-red glow. I felt the chill of the night seeping into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching us. That night, we stayed close together, our fire burning brightly, casting long shadows around the campsite. No one spoke much. We ate, stared into the flames, and avoided looking too far into the woods. The feeling of unease never left me, and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sounds of movement in the trees, of something walking just beyond the reach of the firelight. It felt as though we weren't alone, and not in the way that nature surrounds you with its presence. No, this felt wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of the eerie marks in the woods still playing tricks on my mind. But every crackling twig, every rustling leaf, only made my fear grow. By morning, I was exhausted. We packed up the campsite for the last time, eager to leave. The sun was high in the sky, but the air was still, the trees strangely quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. We made our way back down the mountain, the trail seeming endless as I kept looking over my shoulder. I could still feel that weight pressing down on me, the fear that something was watching. It wasn't until we were nearly back to the car that I finally allowed myself to relax. The tension slowly ebbed away, and I convinced myself that whatever we'd encountered had just been a bad experience. A wild animal, an overactive imagination. We reached the car, piled our gear in the back, and got in. As we drove away, I took one last glance at the mountains, the thick forest receding in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, still and unmoving, watching us leave. For a split second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows of the woods. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. There was no need. The look in their eyes told me they'd felt it too. That unshakable feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't quite done with us. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just a bear or something else entirely, but I know this. I will never go back to those woods again. And if I ever do, I'll be a lot more cautious about what I might find there, hiding in the shadows. The night had already begun to creep in as I finished setting up the camp. The sun was sinking low, and the towering trees that surrounded me stretched their dark arms up to the sky. I could feel the cool breeze rustling through the leaves, the kind that makes the air smell earthy and fresh, yet it brought with it an unsettling sense of emptiness, the kind of silence that you only really notice when you're completely alone. I had decided to go camping by myself this time. I've always loved the outdoors, the simplicity of being surrounded by nature, away from the constant hum of city life. The campsite I had chosen was off the beaten path, a secluded spot near the edge of a forested area. I'd read reviews online about the place, and they all spoke of its beauty, peace, and most importantly, how quiet it was. I had planned to spend a couple of days out here, just to clear my head and disconnect from everything for a while. The forest was serene, the kind of place where you could imagine yourself for hours just listening to the sounds of wildlife. Birds calling, the wind in the trees, the faint rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But now, as the daylight faded, I felt something that wasn't quite right. The campfire crackled and popped in front of me as I sat on a log, warming my hands. I stared into the flames, almost hypnotized by their dance. The firelight flickered against the dark trees that surrounded the clearing, casting long, wavering shadows. I shifted on the log, glancing around. The place didn't feel as peaceful as I had expected. The air was still, and the quiet felt unnatural.
No birds, no insects.
Just silence. I brushed off the feeling. Maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, I had come out here for solitude, and that kind of quiet might be unsettling when you're not used to it. I decided to focus on the warmth of the fire and the smell of burning wood. But the longer I sat there, the more that feeling gnawed at me. I turned my attention back to the surroundings. I had a small tent set up just a few feet away from the fire, my gear neatly piled inside. The stars were starting to appear above, though the treetops made it difficult to see much of the sky. The sound of a twig snapping nearby caught my attention, making my heart skip a beat. I froze. My eyes scanned the darkening forest, but nothing moved. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, though I wasn't convinced. The fire crackled louder, sending a few sparks floating into the air. I stood up, deciding to check on the wood supply. I had brought enough for the night, but I didn't want to risk running out if the night turned colder than I expected. As I grabbed the bundle of firewood next to the tent, I felt it again, the sensation that I wasn't alone. It was subtle, a shift in the air, like someone was watching me. My skin prickled, and I looked around, but still, there was nothing. "Okay, calm down," I muttered, trying to shake off the paranoia. I added more logs to the fire and sat back down, trying to ignore the odd feeling creeping up my spine. The night had fully settled in by now, and it was darker than I thought it would be. The trees above blocked out most of the light from the stars, leaving the area in near total darkness except for the fire. I decided to eat, figuring the routine would help settle my nerves. I had packed a simple meal, canned beans, some bread, and a little jerky. It wasn't much, but it would do. The fire's warmth felt good against the chill of the air as I ate, my eyes constantly flicking toward the tree line. I felt like something was out there, just waiting for me to lower my guard. After dinner, I cleaned up quickly, eager to retire to my tent and get some sleep. I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and settled into my sleeping bag. The inside of the tent smelled faintly of nylon and campfire smoke, a combination that would normally be comforting. But tonight, it wasn't. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside, the occasional crackle from the fire. My mind wandered as I stared at the fabric of the tent above me. Was it the isolation? Was I just not used to being alone for long periods of time? The more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was wrong. the kind of wrong that wasn't easily explained. Then I heard it, a noise, faint but distinct, a slow, deliberate step. It was coming from just outside my tent. My heart slammed in my chest, and I held my breath. Another step, a little closer this time, and then another. My body tensed. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else. The worst part was how quiet it was. Even the wind had stopped. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Just silence and those slow, deliberate steps. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The steps circled the tent, always slow, always measured. They came to a stop just outside the flap of my tent. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick. I waited. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just an animal? A bear? Maybe. I'd heard stories of bears sniffing around campsites, but something about this felt different. This felt like someone was deliberately out there, watching me. The minutes dragged on. I must have laid there for hours, too afraid to fall asleep, too afraid to even breathe normally. The steps never came back. There was no sudden rustling of branches or anything that might indicate the presence of an animal. Everything remained still. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I must have fallen asleep despite myself, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of daylight filtering through the trees. The early morning light cast a soft glow on the ground, and the chill in the air had started to lift. My body ached from lying on the cold ground all night, but I was thankful for the light. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The campsite was exactly as I had left it. Nothing disturbed, no sign of anyone or anything. I stood there for a moment, looking around. Everything looked calm, too calm. I forced myself to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It was probably an animal, I reasoned. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was thick with silence, and every little rustle of the trees or chirp of a bird made me jump. I quickly packed up my things and started to head out, deciding to cut my trip short. Whatever I had felt the night before, I didn't want to stay and find out what else might be lurking in those woods. As I walked back to my car, the hairs on the back of my neck still stood up. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, got in, and slammed the door shut. I didn't look back once as I started the engine and drove away. The road ahead seemed endless, the vast forest stretching on either side of me. I tried to calm myself, but the weight of the night still hung heavy on my chest. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe it was just the isolation. But deep down, I knew there was something I hadn't understood, something I didn't want to understand. That feeling never left me. Even now, as I sit here, writing this down, I can't shake the memory of those deliberate steps. I'm never going back out there. I've told myself it was probably nothing, but I can't help but wonder, was it an animal? Or was it something else? Something I'll never fully understand? I've always loved the outdoors, the feeling of being in the wilderness, away from all the noise and distractions of the city. It's just me, the trees, the wind, and the quiet. But this time, something was different. It all started when I decided to go camping alone. I hadn't done it in a while, and I figured it'd be a good break from the chaos of daily life. I picked a campsite deep in the woods, far enough away from the trails where people usually go, so I could have some solitude. The weather forecast was good, and the location was ideal for what I had in mind: peace and quiet. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and my trusty flashlight. I made sure to bring extra batteries, as you can never be too prepared in the wilderness. When I arrived at the site, it was perfect. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. There was a small stream nearby, the sound of water running over rocks providing a soothing backdrop. I set up my tent with ease, just like I had done so many times before. As night fell, I made a small fire and sat down to enjoy the peace. I roasted some marshmallows and listened to the sounds of nature around me. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. Everything felt right. But then, just as the last embers of the fire started to die down, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the trees. I paused, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or some animal moving through the brush. But then it came again, louder this time. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stood up, straining my ears to listen. There was no breeze. The air was still. The sound continued, getting closer. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing to be afraid of. After all, this was a camping trip, not a horror movie. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of trees and the occasional flash of a distant animal's eyes reflecting the light. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon or some other creature I wasn't familiar with. But the feeling of unease didn't fade. It grew. My instincts were telling me something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. I retreated to the safety of my tent, zipped it up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest were louder now, but the strange crunching noise had stopped. I breathed a little easier, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting eerie shadows against the walls of my tent. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that crunching sound again, just faint enough to make me question whether I had imagined it. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then, in the middle of the night, it came again. Louder this time, unmistakable. It was a person, or something walking on two legs, not an animal. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps weren't hurried, but they weren't casual either. They were deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was making sure I heard them. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The flashlight felt too far away. The zipper of my tent, the thin fabric between me and whatever was out there, seemed so fragile. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I waited for the next sound, my body tense, every muscle on edge. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. Minutes passed and I dared not move. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, my breath shallow. And just when I thought I might be imagining it all, I heard something else. A soft rustling right outside my tent, like someone or something was standing just inches away, trying to be quiet, but not succeeding. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. I flicked it on and pointed it toward the sound. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing. There was no one there, no animal, no shadow, nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't explain it. My instincts were screaming at me that I wasn't alone. I couldn't stay there anymore. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my things, shoved my gear hastily into my backpack, and unzipped the tent. I didn't look around. I just ran. I wasn't sure where I was going at first. I just knew I had to get away from that spot. I ran through the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. The crunch of leaves under my feet was deafening in the silence of the night. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching out like claws. I had no idea where I was going. The fear and adrenaline clouded my judgment, and soon, I was completely lost. I had no map, no compass, just my instincts guiding me. After what felt like hours of running, I finally stopped. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The woods were silent again, almost too quiet, but at least the feeling of being watched had faded. I knew I wasn't in the clear yet, but I felt safer. I took a few minutes to calm myself and gather my thoughts. I had to find my way back to the car. I knew I couldn't go back to the campsite, not after what had happened. But I couldn't stay here either. I needed to get out of the woods. The flashlight's beam flickered, and I cursed under my breath. I didn't have much time left with it. I started walking in the direction I thought would lead me to the road. My thoughts were racing, my heart still pounding. What had that noise been? Was it just an animal? Or something or someone else? The walk was long and exhausting. My legs burned, and my mind raced with the possibilities of what might have happened back at the campsite. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became. I wasn't sure I would ever find that campsite again. I didn't even care. Hours passed, and finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. I had made it out. The car, the road, civilization. By the time I reached my car, it was nearly dawn. I didn't bother starting the engine right away. I sat there in silence, my hands shaking, my mind replaying everything that had happened. It was real. It wasn't a dream. Whatever had happened back there, I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back into those woods. Not for a long time. I had always enjoyed the outdoors, the sense of peace, and the beauty of nature. That's why I decided to go camping alone last weekend. I had been busy with work, and the idea of a solo trip to recharge sounded perfect. My plan was simple: hike to a remote spot in the woods, set up camp, and spend 2 days disconnected from the world. The day I arrived was clear, with the sun shining brightly and a light breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car in a small lot near the trailhead and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food. Everything I needed for a few days in the woods. I locked up my car, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and began my hike. The trail was a long one, winding through dense forest and across streams. It wasn't a well-known trail, and I didn't pass anyone the entire time. The silence was comforting at first, the occasional bird chirping or a branch cracking beneath my boots. But as I walked deeper into the woods, it felt more isolated. The trees grew thicker, blocking the sunlight and creating long shadows on the ground. By the time I reached my campsite, it was late afternoon. The spot I picked was a small clearing next to a stream. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As the flames flickered and popped, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. The stress of work, the noise of the city, everything felt far away. I was alone, yes, but it was a peaceful kind of solitude. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, enjoying the crackle of the logs and the cool evening air. After I ate, I sat by the fire for a while, watching the stars start to appear in the clear night sky. It was incredibly quiet, the kind of silence that fills your ears and makes every small sound stand out. A rustle in the bushes, a twig snapping in the distance. I brushed it off, probably just an animal. Around midnight, the fire had died down, and I retreated into my tent. I zipped myself inside, unrolled my sleeping bag, and tried to fall asleep. But there was something about the silence that felt off. I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't the normal peace I was used to. It felt too still, too quiet. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just the woods at night. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A faint sound of movement, something brushing against the side of my tent. The noise was light, almost like something small was circling my camp. could have been an animal, a deer or a raccoon, I told myself. But why was it lingering around so long? The noise continued, growing fainter, then louder, then fading again. My heart started to race, but I fought to stay calm. I told myself again it was nothing, just animals doing their thing in the woods. At some point, I fell into a restless sleep, waking up every few hours, always to the same unsettling silence. The next morning, I woke up early with the sun peeking through the trees. I crawled out of the tent, stretching my stiff legs. The air was cooler than I expected, the moisture of the night still hanging in the trees. I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off, but I tried to ignore it. I had a long hike planned for the day, so I packed up my tent and gear and headed further into the woods. I walked for hours, taking in the beauty of the forest. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no trail to follow now, just a sense of being surrounded by nature's vastness. It was beautiful, but there was an eerie stillness, like the woods were watching me. I could hear distant calls of birds, the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush, but nothing close enough to be alarming. Around noon, I stopped by a small creek to take a break. I sat on a rock, eating the granola bars I'd brought along. The water ran clear and cool, and I dipped my hands in to refresh myself. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. But as I sat there, something in the woods caught my attention. A faint, barely audible noise, a sound I couldn't quite place. It was like someone or something was moving through the undergrowth, keeping just out of sight. I stood up, scanning the trees, trying to spot whatever it was. But there was nothing, no movement. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly packed up, deciding it was time to head back to camp. When I returned to the clearing, I noticed something odd. My campfire, which I had left cold and unlit, had been disturbed. The logs were scattered, the ashes kicked up as if someone, or something, had been poking around. I had been gone for hours. No animals could have done this. I was on edge now, my earlier unease turning into something more serious. My instincts were telling me to leave, to pack up and go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I kept checking the woods, scanning every shadow, every rustle in the trees. But there was nothing. I decided to stay, to try and get some rest before heading out the next morning. I kept the fire going late into the evening, hoping the light would provide some comfort. But as the night wore on, the sounds returned, those faint, scraping noises, movement around the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I was no longer sure if it was animals. The sounds were too deliberate, too cautious. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't help but think I wasn't alone. The night dragged on, and I stayed as still as I could, straining to listen to every noise. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I would hold my breath, waiting for it to stop. And then I heard it, a soft but unmistakable sound. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, careful steps just outside my tent. I froze. My mind raced. I had to make a decision, run or face whatever was out there. I stayed perfectly still, trying to control my breathing, praying that whatever it was would go away. The footsteps stopped. The silence felt suffocating. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to peek out, but I didn't dare. Then, the footsteps started moving again, but this time, they were farther away. I waited, and after what felt like an eternity, I heard nothing more. Stillness, complete silence. I waited another hour, listening for any signs of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The area around me was dark and still, the only sound the occasional crack of a twig in the distance. I scanned the ground for any sign of who or what had been nearby, but there were no tracks, no footprints. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even standing just out of sight the entire time. I didn't stay much longer that night. I packed up everything I could and left, trekking back down the trail as quickly as I could manage. By the time I reached my car, the sun was rising. The woods looked peaceful again, calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps outside my tent, the silence that felt more like a threat than a comfort. I didn't go back to those woods. There's something about that kind of isolation, something that feels wrong when you're alone and you can't trust what your instincts are telling you. It might have just been an animal or a trick of the mind, but I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. Some places are too quiet, too still, and you never know what's lurking just out of sight. I packed my gear carefully, making sure to double-check everything. A few days in the woods alone. That's what I had been looking forward to.
No distractions.
Just me, nature, and some peace and quiet. I'd been feeling overwhelmed lately with work, life, and everything that came with it. A camping trip was supposed to clear my head, to give me that time away. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong. I drove for hours until the trailhead was in sight, the place I'd picked for my solo camping trip. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I wanted. Most people went to the big national parks, but this was smaller, quieter, a patch of forest not marked on every map. When I pulled in, there was no one else around. Not a car in sight, just the trees and the stillness. I set up my tent, hung my food in a tree far away from where I'd sleep, and lit a small fire. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows between the trees, the air crisp. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the wood the only sound. It felt good to be alone, to just sit in the quiet with nothing to do but think. I had no agenda, no worries. That night, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped quickly. The fire kept me warm, though, and I settled into the comfort of my sleeping bag, the sound of the fire still crackling in the background. The forest outside seemed peaceful, a little eerie in its own way, but peaceful. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a snap. It was soft, faint, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat. I listened for a second, but the sounds of the forest, crickets, wind in the trees, filled the air again. I shook it off, reminding myself I was alone in the woods. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something smaller like a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't tell what, but it was a feeling in my gut, one that made me pull the sleeping bag tighter around me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just that sense that something was different, out of place. I finally fell asleep, but not deeply. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crackle of the fire. At one point, I heard what seemed like footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. They didn't sound like the usual forest noises. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a large one like a bear. But why would it be so deliberate? Why so slow? I sat up in my tent, looking out the small window, but I could only see the outline of trees, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The forest was so quiet now, as if it held its breath with me. After a long while, I got up, deciding to check the area. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, careful not to make too much noise. The air was cold, and the wind had died down, leaving everything still. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the ground, expecting to see animal tracks. Instead, the beam caught something odd. In the dirt, just outside the ring of my firelight, were large footprints. They were too big to be a deer, too wide for any bear I'd ever seen. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I traced the outline of the prints in the dirt. There was something off about them, almost human, but not quite. The depth, the size, nothing about them felt normal. I stood up, a knot forming in my stomach. A cold shiver ran through me, and I felt the need to get back to my tent. Fast. I turned, but just as I was about to take a step, a twig snapped behind me. It was too loud to be an animal, too deliberate to be just the wind. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure, only the dark, towering trees around me. My mind raced. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight flicking around in a panic now, and rushed back to my tent. I zipped it up as fast as I could, my heart pounding. Inside, I tried to calm myself. The footprints had spooked me. The sound had spooked me, but I couldn't let fear take over. It was just me out here, and I had to remind myself of that. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every few minutes, I would hear something. A rustling, a snap, a distant thud, and I would snap awake, sitting up in the dark. I checked the food hanging from the tree. It was still there, untouched. Nothing had disturbed it. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, in the distance, I heard something that wasn't in my imagination. A howl. It was distant, but unmistakable. A long, drawn-out cry that echoed through the woods. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a wolf, not the kind of howl I knew. It was something deeper, more guttural. The sound of it crawled up my spine, leaving a trail of dread. I sat in silence, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this forest, that whatever made that noise was getting closer. I laid there, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening intently. But nothing happened for a while. The forest outside remained quiet, and I began to convince myself that it was just an animal, something I had never heard before. Maybe a coyote, maybe some other creature making an unusual sound. Just as I began to relax, I heard it again. This time closer, much closer. The howl was louder now, rising in pitch, a strange, disturbing sound. Sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed my flashlight again, hands shaking, and I turned it on, shining the beam out through the tent. Nothing. The area around me was still. No movement, just trees. The shadows of the night were thick, and the beam of light barely cut through them. I stayed still, breathing shallowly, trying to keep my composure. What if something was out there? Something I hadn't heard before? Something no one had seen? My mind raced with possibilities. I heard the footsteps again, unmistakable, soft but deliberate. This time it was definitely too close for comfort. Too close for comfort. I glanced out the small window of my tent. The beam of my flashlight caught a movement, a shadow. My heart dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I don't know how long I stayed there, my breath caught in my throat, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out here? There were no trails,
No campgrounds.
just the deep woods. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, my phone, and without a moment's hesitation, I started packing up. I was done. I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to walk for miles to get to the nearest road. I wasn't staying out here. Just as I was about to zip up my bag, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, a soft whisper, barely audible, like it was carried by the wind. Leave. It wasn't a human voice, at least not one that sounded normal. It was hollow, cold, and almost metallic. I rushed out of the tent, grabbed my stuff, and without looking back, I started running. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every snap of a twig felt like someone was following me. Every rustle in the bushes felt like it was right behind me. I ran as fast as I could, heart hammering, feet stumbling, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't care about the dark anymore. I didn't care about the fear. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless, trembling, and drenched in sweat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, just sitting there for a moment, trying to regain my bearings. I didn't know what I had seen out there or who or what was out there, but I was sure of one thing: I would never go back. The forest was meant to be peaceful, but out there, I learned that sometimes the quiet is just the calm before something else. Something I didn't want to know more about. It was supposed to be just a simple camping trip. My friends and I had planned it for weeks. A weekend in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. We wanted to escape the grind, the endless texts and calls, the constant rush. Just the sound of the wind, the crackling of the campfire, and the fresh, pine-scented air seemed perfect, a chance to reconnect with nature. But things never go as planned, do they? We arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow on the trees. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind moved through them. I could feel the weight of the quiet pressing down on me as we unloaded the car. I was glad to be away from the constant buzz of my phone, from work, from life. This was supposed to be the perfect escape. The campground was remote. No cabins, no fancy amenities. Just a few spaced-out campsites, each with its own fire ring and a small clearing. There were no people around. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves, which I liked. As we set up our tents, I noticed that the woods felt denser than I expected. The trees were tightly packed, and there was a kind of hush in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it didn't sit right with me. We built a fire, and soon the crackling flames were dancing in front of us. The warmth spread through the cool evening air, and I settled in on a log near the fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. My friends were laughing, cooking hot dogs, and telling stories. I wanted to join in, to feel the excitement, but something was off. The woods felt too still. Night came quickly, the kind of night where the darkness seems to swallow up everything. We ate, talked, and joked, the fire flickering and casting long shadows across our campsite. It was around midnight when the first odd thing happened. It started with a sound, a soft thudding noise coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch breaking, but it was too rhythmic. It almost sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from deeper in the forest. I froze, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but the trees were too thick. I glanced around at my friends, but they seemed oblivious, lost in their conversation. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The noise stopped for a moment, and I breathed a little easier. But then it came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was dark beyond the firelight, too dark to see anything. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. "Hey, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly as I looked around the campfire. My friends looked at me, confused. "Hear what?" one of them asked. "The noise?" I said, feeling ridiculous. "It sounds like footsteps." They all laughed, brushing it off as just the wind or an animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The thudding continued, a slow, steady beat coming from the trees, like someone walking through the forest, deliberately. And it wasn't just the noise, It was the silence that followed it. The way everything else in the forest seemed to hold its breath. No animals, no wind rustling through the leaves, just that unnerving sound, and then complete stillness. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, feeling the need to check it out. But before I could take a step, the sound stopped. Just like that, the forest went completely silent. I stood there, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand, the air suddenly thick with tension. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just an animal moving through the trees or some other natural explanation. But deep down, I felt like something wasn't right. We spent the rest of the night sitting around the fire, a little more tense than before, but eventually, the noise stopped and we tried to shake off the weird feeling. The fire flickered out and the embers glowed softly in the dark. I lay down in my tent, trying to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that thudding sound in my mind. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and purple. The others were still asleep, so I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the tent, breathing in the crisp morning air. The forest looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, more peaceful. I wandered down the trail, my boots crunching on the forest floor. I wasn't sure where I was going, but the need to be away from the camp, away from the fire and the noise, was overwhelming. I followed the path for what felt like an hour. The trees here were thicker, their branches reaching out like long fingers. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something else, something faintly unpleasant. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. That's when I saw it. A trail just off the main path. It wasn't much, a few broken branches and a faint impression in the leaves, but it was there. It looked like someone had walked through recently. The trail veered off into the deeper part of the woods, and despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I couldn't resist. I needed to know what was out there. I followed the trail, pushing through thick underbrush and brambles. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was filled with questions. Who had made this trail? Why was it so recent? And why did I feel like I was being watched? As I walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the light grew dimmer. The trees felt closer, the space between them narrowing. The silence here was different, heavier, almost suffocating. I kept walking, my mind racing. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't turn back now. Finally, I reached the end of the trail, and there, in the middle of the clearing, was something that stopped me in my tracks. It was an abandoned campsite. It wasn't much, just a few old, burned-out logs and a broken tent. But what caught my attention was the strange arrangement of rocks. They were piled in a circle, perfectly symmetrical, as if someone had spent hours arranging them. In the center of the circle was a stick, bent at an odd angle, like it had been placed there intentionally. I stepped closer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was something wrong about this place, something off about the way everything was arranged. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the thudding sound. Only this time it was much closer. Thud, thud, thud. I froze, my body tensing as the noise grew louder. Whoever or whatever had been following me was right behind me. Without thinking, I spun around and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the forest floor, branches slapping at my face, the thudding sound growing louder and louder in my ears. It was like something was chasing me, following me every step of the way. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I burst back into the clearing where the camp was. I didn't even bother stopping to explain. I just grabbed my stuff and shouted for everyone to pack up. I don't know how they saw the panic in my face, but they didn't ask questions. They packed up quickly, silently, as I glanced nervously into the trees, expecting to see someone or something emerge from the shadows. We left as fast as we could, and we didn't stop until we reached the car. As I sat there, breathing heavily, I realized one thing. I had never been so scared in my life. There was something in those woods, something that I couldn't explain. And whatever it was real. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was something else, something we're not meant to understand. But what I do know is this: some places are better left unexplored, and I'm never going back to that campsite again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just a quick escape from the noise of the city, a chance to get some fresh air, enjoy nature, and maybe clear my head a bit. I had been under a lot of stress lately. Work, life, everything. So the thought of a peaceful camping trip in the woods seemed perfect. I packed my gear, made sure to bring enough food, a good tent, and my trusty flashlight. Everything was set for a relaxing time. I drove for hours, the road winding through dense forest, the trees growing taller as I moved further into the wilderness. The GPS was spotty at best, but I trusted the directions I'd gotten from the website. The campsite was supposed to be secluded, perfect for someone who wanted to escape. No one else around, just me, the forest, and the quiet, or so I thought. I finally reached the turnoff, the narrow, unpaved road barely wide enough for my car. I slowed down, the crunch of gravel under my tires echoing in the otherwise silent surroundings. The dense trees on either side of me looked like they were closing in, their branches thick and twisted, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier here, a mix of pine and earth, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't anything too strange, but the isolation of the place started to feel more oppressive than peaceful. I kept driving, passing an old, rotting wooden sign that simply read, "Campsite 3 miles." There was no indication of anyone else being here, but I didn't mind that. It was exactly what I wanted. I just wanted to be alone. When I finally pulled into the campsite, it was even more remote than I expected. There were a few fire pits, a couple of picnic tables, and a small creek running nearby. The place was deserted, and that was exactly how I liked it. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing, the tires crunching on the dirt, and I got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. I set up camp quickly. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the site. The air had a bite to it, like the night was coming in fast. I started a small fire, gathering dry twigs and logs from the area. The warmth of the fire helped settle my nerves, but the surrounding woods felt eerily quiet. It was too still. There were no animals, no birds chirping, not even the usual hum of insects. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just because it was late in the season. As I sat there, watching the flames dance in front of me, I tried to relax. The crackle of the fire was soothing. I had brought a book, but I wasn't really in the mood to read. Instead, I stared into the fire, lost in my thoughts. The forest around me seemed to close in even more, and a gust of wind rustled the trees. But that was it. It was just the wind. There was nothing to worry about. The evening wore on, and the sky grew darker. I finished my dinner, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the branches above me. The night was quiet, save for the occasional snap of a twig or the sound of something moving in the distance. At first, I tried to ignore it, but after a while, the noises started to feel off. They were too deliberate, like something was trying to get closer without being noticed. I listened harder. There it was again. A snap of a branch, followed by a rustling sound. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just some critter, a deer or something. I took a deep breath, then closed my eyes trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, the uneasy feeling growing stronger. Every little sound in the woods outside felt like it was magnified, amplified. The wind howled, shaking the branches, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat now. It wasn't an animal. There was something out there. I sat up in my tent, trying to control my breathing. The flashlight lay beside me on the ground. I grabbed it, slowly unzipping the flap of my tent, careful not to make a sound. I peeked out into the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the faint light from the fire still burning low. The forest was still, too still. I didn't see anything. No animals, no movement. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach was undeniable. There was something out there, something watching. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but there was no service. Not that I expected any, but still the lack of connection added to the sense of isolation. I stayed up for hours, the sounds of the forest never quite letting up. I would hear the occasional crack or rustle, and each time, my heart would race. But nothing ever came close. The shadows stretched long, the fire now barely more than glowing embers. Eventually, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, dragging sound, like something large and heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze. It was too dark to see anything, but it was close. So close, I could hear the leaves and branches scraping together as whatever it was moved closer. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. I felt my throat tighten with fear. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and crawled out of the tent, stepping carefully onto the cold ground. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and undergrowth in sharp contrast. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the empty, silent woods. Then, through the beam of light, I saw it, movement, a shadow, but not the usual kind. It wasn't just a tree swaying in the wind. This was something much larger. My pulse quickened. I stood frozen, my hand clutching the flashlight, the light flickering slightly as my nerves got the best of me. The sound of dragging stopped. Then it started again. This time, it was coming from the left, just beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing. The sound was so slow, deliberate, like something or someone was dragging its feet on purpose. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. There was no one there, but the noise stopped. The entire forest seemed to go silent once more. The air felt thick with tension. I decided to do the only thing I could think of, leave. I wasn't staying out here alone, not with whatever that was in the woods. I quickly packed up my things, stuffing my sleeping bag and gear into my backpack. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out from the darkness. I made my way back to the car, my footsteps quick and hurried. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig made me jump. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had heard. What had I really heard? What was out there? But no answers came. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark. I didn't look back as I drove away. I kept my eyes on the road, focusing on the curve of the path ahead, until I finally reached the main road. The familiar hum of civilization was a welcome sound after the quiet, oppressive stillness of the woods. By the time I was a few miles away, I could feel my heart rate returning to normal, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the dark stretch of road behind me. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my head. What had happened? Was it just my imagination running wild? Maybe I was just too tired, or maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. It was real. I wasn't crazy. Something had been out there. I've never gone camping since that night. I've driven past that spot a few times, but I've never stopped. Something about it, something about the way the forest felt that night, still unsettles me. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to, but I learned something that night. Sometimes, the woods can be more than just a quiet place. Sometimes they hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away before you find out what's really out there. So I kept driving, and I haven't looked back. I'll never forget that camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything. Just me, the wilderness, and the sound of the wind threading through the trees. I wanted something quiet and solitary, a chance to clear my head after months of city noise and the relentless buzz of work. I'd read about this spot, an isolated stretch of forest in a state park that was barely visited, miles away from the main trails. Perfect. I packed light but carefully. My old but reliable tent, a sturdy sleeping bag, a small propane stove, plenty of water, some dehydrated meals, and basic survival gear. I double-checked everything. A whistle, a map, a compass, a fully charged power bank, and a satellite phone. I wasn't planning to take unnecessary risks. Still, being out there alone always carries some level of unpredictability. I wanted to be ready for anything. The drive took about 4 hours. It was the kind of trip where you watch the world change around you. The city gave way to suburbs, then to small towns, and finally to open stretches of road lined with tall pines. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the trailhead, my phone had lost service. I didn't mind. That was the point. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a GPS app on my phone to back up my map and compass. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The first few miles were easy enough. The trees were dense, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled rich and earthy, the way it does after a rain. Every so often, I'd hear the rustle of something small darting through the undergrowth, probably a squirrel or a bird. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, just me and nature. I hiked for about 3 hours before I reached the spot I'd picked on the map. It was a small clearing near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and laying out my gear inside. The creek was close enough that I could hear the water trickling over the rocks, a soft, soothing sound that made the place feel even more peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the small campfire I'd built, and watched the stars come out. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching overhead, a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness. It was beautiful. I stayed up later than I'd planned, just sitting there, listening to the forest and staring at the stars. Eventually, the chill of the night drove me into my tent, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I saw deer tracks near the water and even spotted a small herd grazing in a meadow farther upstream. They looked up when they saw me but didn't run. I'm not sure why, but that moment stayed with me. It felt like I was part of the forest, not just passing through it. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. I made dinner and settled in for another quiet evening by the fire. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt off. It wasn't anything big, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had been so full of sound all day, was suddenly quiet. Not completely silent, but subdued. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth seemed to have faded away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe I just hadn't noticed the change until now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I stayed up later than I had the night before, listening to the quiet and watching the shadows deepen around my camp. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, the snap of a twig, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that presses against your ears. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I froze, straining to identify it. It sounded like breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too regular, too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening, but the sound didn't return. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, every nerve on edge. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the day trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I went for another hike, kept busy with small tasks around camp, but the feeling lingered. That night, I built the fire a little bigger and kept it burning longer. I stayed up as late as I could, but eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. I crawled into my tent, telling myself that the forest was just playing tricks on me, that I'd imagined the sound. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The breathing was back, louder now, more insistent. It was right outside the tent. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, and fumbled it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but I didn't dare open the flap. The breathing continued, slow and steady, until, just like before, it stopped. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with every movement. The forest felt different that morning, heavier somehow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to the car was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, following me. But the trail was empty, the forest as still and silent as it had been the night before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me, that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me doesn't believe that. Part of me knows there was something, someone, in those woods that night. I'll never go back to find out. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The air was crisp, the leaves a mosaic of red, orange, and gold, and I wanted to escape the monotony of my daily routine. I'd been working long hours, hunched over a desk, and I needed a break. The wilderness had always been my remedy, a way to clear my mind and reset. I chose a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains, a place I'd read about online. It wasn't a popular spot, which suited me just fine. Solitude was the goal. I packed light but efficient. A tent, sleeping bag, food rations, water, and a small first aid kit. I also brought along a flashlight, a map, and a compass. Even though my phone had GPS, I didn't want to rely on it entirely. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. The road twisted and turned through dense forests, the kind where trees seemed to close in around you, blocking out the sky. When I arrived, there were no other cars in the parking lot. It was just me and the wilderness. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, locked my car, and started down the trail. The first few hours were uneventful but beautiful. The trail wound through towering oaks and maples, their leaves crunching under my boots. I spotted a deer in the distance, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Birds chirped overhead, their songs echoing in the stillness. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small, bubbling creek. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the water source was close by. I pitched my tent, careful to secure it against the wind, and gathered some dry wood for a fire. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped, and I layered up in a fleece jacket. The fire crackled warmly as I cooked a simple meal: instant noodles and a protein bar. The steam from the pot mingled with the cool evening air. I sat on a log, staring into the flames, letting the warmth seep into my skin. Night fell quickly, and soon, the forest was cloaked in darkness. The stars above were brilliant, undimmed by city lights. It was the kind of beauty that made you feel small in the best way. Around 9 p.m., I decided to turn in. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and I doused it with water before crawling into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and I felt a deep sense of contentment as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. I lay still, listening. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. But there was something else, a faint noise that didn't belong. It was a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on the forest floor. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer were common in this area, and raccoons often foraged at night. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate, moving closer. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I unzipped the tent and shone it outside. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I listened again, but the footsteps had stopped. My heart was still racing, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent to find the forest bathed in golden sunlight. The unease of the night before seemed silly in the daylight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. As I ate breakfast, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the soft dirt near my campsite. They weren't mine. The tread was different and they were fresh. My stomach tightened. It wasn't unheard of for hikers to pass through remote areas, but these prints circled my campsite. Whoever it was had been close, uncomfortably close. I decided to pack up and move to a new spot. I didn't want to stay where someone had been lurking in the middle of the night. I hiked for several hours, putting as much distance as I could between me and the first campsite. Around midday, I found another suitable spot near a larger creek. It was more open, with fewer trees and better visibility. I set up my tent again and tried to shake off my paranoia. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I explored the area, took some photos, and even found a small waterfall upstream. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. That night, I made sure to keep my fire going a little longer. The light and warmth felt like a shield against the darkness. I stayed up later than usual, watching the stars and listening to the creek's gentle gurgle. Eventually, I couldn't fight my exhaustion any longer and crawled into my tent. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps was back. They were closer now, circling my tent. My pulse thundered in my ears as I lay there, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Whoever it was didn't speak or make any other noise, just the crunch of their steps. Then they stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps resumed, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn broke, I emerged from my tent, shaken but determined to figure out what was going on. Once again, I found footprints around my campsite. This time, they led off into the woods. I debated whether to follow them, but decided against it. The last thing I wanted was to confront whoever was out there. Instead, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The hike felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, or so it seemed. I finally reached my car in the late afternoon, my legs aching and my back sore from the weight of my pack. Relief washed over me as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been out there. It could have been another camper, someone who didn't realize how unsettling their behavior was. Or it could have been something more sinister. Either way, I was grateful to be heading home. The wilderness, once my refuge, had turned into something else entirely. It was a long time before I went camping again. I remember that trip so vividly, every detail burned into my memory. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect from the endless scroll of screens and emails. I packed my bag with all the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. I double-checked everything because the campsite I had in mind was pretty remote. It was the kind of place where your phone signal disappeared halfway down the trail. The drive was uneventful, long stretches of asphalt cutting through rolling hills and dense forests. I'd chosen a spot about 4 hours away from home, deep in the state park. It wasn't a popular campground. There were no marked sites or facilities, just a patch of wilderness where you could pitch a tent and feel completely alone. That's what I wanted: peace, quiet, and solitude. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, it was mid-afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of clean, pine-scented air you only find deep in the woods. I strapped on my backpack, locked the car, and set off down the trail. The path was narrow but well-trodden, winding through towering pines and oaks. I walked for what felt like an hour, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. I found the spot just as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream about 50 yards away. The water was clear, trickling over smooth stones, and I knew it would be my main water source for the weekend. I set down my pack and got to work setting up my tent. It was one of those lightweight two-person models, easy to assemble. Within half an hour, I had it pitched, the rainfly secured, and my sleeping bag unrolled inside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I gathered some fallen branches and built a small fire. The crackling flames were comforting, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I heated a can of chili over the fire and ate it straight from the can, washing it down with a bottle of water. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun was gone, and I pulled on an extra layer before settling into my camping chair, staring up at the stars. It was one of those nights where the sky seemed impossibly vast, every star sharp and bright against the inky blackness. I felt small, but in a good way, like I was part of something much bigger. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the night. Eventually, the chill drove me into my tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, turned off my flashlight, and let the silence of the woods lull me to sleep. I woke up once during the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a sound that woke me, at least not one I could identify. I lay there in the dark, listening intently. The woods have their own rhythm, a mix of distant hoots, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch. But this was different. There was an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark, and eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I felt refreshed, the unease of the night before forgotten. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. I found a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below and spent hours just sitting there, soaking it all in. It was the kind of peace I'd been craving. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, tired but content. I refilled my water bottles at the stream and started preparing dinner. As the sun began to set, I noticed the first signs of a change in the weather. The breeze that had been pleasant all day grew stronger, colder, and carried a dampness that hinted at rain. Thick clouds rolled in, obscuring the stars. I decided to turn in early, not wanting to get caught outside if a storm rolled through. The rain started around midnight. At first, it was a gentle patter on the tent, almost soothing, but it quickly grew heavier, the wind picking up and making the fabric of the tent flap noisily. I lay there, listening to the storm, grateful for the waterproof tent. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rain. A rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on wet leaves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't match. It was too deliberate, too heavy. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop just outside the tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The storm masked almost everything, but I was certain someone, or something, was out there. I reached for my knife, the only real weapon I had, and gripped it tightly. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and the sound didn't return. Finally, I convinced myself it had been nothing, just my imagination fueled by the isolation and the storm. I forced myself to relax, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent cautiously. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and a thick fog clung to the trees. I looked around the campsite, searching for any sign that someone had been there. That's when I saw it. A single muddy footprint just a few feet from my tent. It wasn't mine. It was larger, heavier, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost in the storm and wandered through without realizing I was there. That had to be it, right? Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to pack up and head back to the car. The thought of spending another night out there didn't sit well with me. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was eerily quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my nerves on edge. By the time I hit the trail, I was practically jogging, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and that campsite. The trail felt different on the way back, more sinister somehow. The trees seemed to close in, the fog thickening until it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, made me jump. I told myself it was just the wind, just the forest, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. About halfway back to the trailhead, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, but the fog was too thick to see anything. I yelled out, hoping to scare off whatever it was, but the footsteps didn't stop. They just kept coming, steady and unrelenting. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran, my pack bouncing against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail seemed endless, every turn revealing more fog and more trees. I kept looking back, but I couldn't see anything. Still, I felt it, a presence, something just out of sight, following me. When I finally reached the trailhead, I practically collapsed against my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, before starting the engine and tearing out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there really was someone out there, lurking in the woods. All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. No cars, no notifications, just me and the raw, unfiltered wilderness. It's the kind of peace I don't find anywhere else. That's why, last summer, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the woods of a national forest I'd never been to before. I'd heard it was remote, quiet, and perfect for a weekend away from everything. The plan was simple. Drive up on Friday, hike a few miles in, find a good spot to set up camp, and spend a couple of days exploring the trails before heading back Sunday evening. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty multi-tool. I even brought a map of the area, marked with the trails and a couple of streams I could use to refill my water if needed. I thought I was prepared for anything. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the kind of drive where you're half listening to the radio but mostly just watching the scenery change as you get farther from the city. By the time I parked, it was already late afternoon. The air smelled fresh, the kind of fresh you only get when you're miles away from any civilization. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started down the trail. The first couple of miles were easy. The path was well-trodden, and the markers were clear. It felt good to stretch my legs after sitting in the car for so long. I passed a couple of hikers heading back toward the parking lot, and we exchanged polite nods. After that, I didn't see anyone. The forest started to feel more alive the deeper I went. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, even if I couldn't see what was sharing the woods with me. Around 6 o'clock, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing just off the trail, with enough flat ground for my tent and a few rocks I could use as a makeshift fire ring. There was even a fallen log nearby that looked perfect for sitting on. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood before the sun dipped too low. By the time the sky started turning shades of orange and pink, I had a small fire going and a pot of water heating up for dinner. As I ate, the forest around me grew darker and quieter. The chirping of birds gave way to the rhythmic hum of crickets, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl reminded me just how far I was from anyone else. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that's almost unnerving when you're used to constant noise and motion. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the night. When the fire burned down to embers, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. I woke up once during the night. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. The fire was long dead, and the only light came from the faint sliver of moon peeking through the trees. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me up. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was quiet, but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to hear more. A few seconds later, there it was again, closer this time. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around, but something about it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I scanned the clearing, moving the light slowly from side to side. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I shook off the unease from the night before. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and I had a full day of exploring ahead of me. After a quick breakfast, I packed a smaller day pack with water, snacks, and my map, and set off down the trail. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering trees and patches of wildflowers. I followed the trail for a couple of miles before branching off onto a smaller, less traveled path that wasn't marked on the map. It looked like it had been used recently. The grass was flattened, and there were faint boot prints in the dirt. I followed the path for what must have been an hour, maybe more. It wound through the trees, crossing a shallow stream and climbing up a small ridge. The view from the top was incredible. I could see the forest stretching out for miles, a sea of green under a bright blue sky. I sat there for a while, drinking water and enjoying the quiet. But as I started back down the ridge, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, in the dirt, were my footprints from earlier. But right next to them was another set of prints. They were larger than mine, and the tread pattern didn't match my boots. Someone had followed me. I froze, my eyes darting around the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that it was probably just another hiker who'd happened to take the same path. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to set. I tried to act normal, going through the motions of building a fire and cooking dinner, but my nerves were on edge. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around, my heart pounding. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched never went away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. The snapping of twigs, closer this time, then a rustling, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and my multi-tool, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, but the sounds continued, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling me. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my flashlight pointed at the darkness, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Eventually, the sound stopped, but I didn't dare go back to sleep. I sat by the dead fire, clutching my multi-tool and jumping at every little noise until the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead. I didn't bother with breakfast or even trying to enjoy the morning. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt like it took forever. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me or see someone step out from the trees. But the trail stayed empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I tossed my pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled out onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I don't know who or what was out there that weekend. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone curious or harmless who didn't realize how much they were scaring me. Or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never gone camping alone again. I never thought a simple weekend camping trip could go so wrong. I had been camping before plenty of times. It wasn't anything new to me. Just me, my backpack, my tent, and the quiet isolation of the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be simple. But this time it wasn't. I had driven out to a spot I'd researched online, somewhere in the dense forest of a national park about 2 hours from home. The reviews mentioned it being quiet, not too crowded, and perfect for anyone looking to get away from the noise of daily life. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed up everything I'd need: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, plenty of food and water, and headed out early Saturday morning. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just 1 or 2 cars parked under the tall pines. I liked it that way. Less noise, less chance of running into people. I checked my map, double-checked my gear, and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, winding through a mix of dense forest and open clearings. The sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns of light on the ground. I felt at ease, the stress of the week already melting away with each step deeper into the wilderness. After about 3 miles, I reached a fork in the trail. To the right was the main path, leading to a designated camping area a few more miles in. To the left was a narrower, less trodden path that didn't seem to be marked on the map. I hesitated for a moment, considering my options. The main path would be safer, but it also meant a higher chance of running into other campers. The narrow path, though less predictable, seemed like it might lead to a quieter spot. I decided to take it. Something about the idea of being truly alone appealed to me. The trail became rougher the further I went. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, and I had to watch my step carefully. The forest seemed to grow denser here, the trees pressing in closer and the light dimming. After about another mile, I came across a small clearing, just large enough for my tent and a small fire pit. It felt secluded, far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. I set up camp, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and gathering some wood for a fire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional call of a bird or distant rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I felt completely alone, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. But as the night fell and the fire burned down to embers, the woods around me seemed to change. The stillness felt heavier, almost oppressive. The sounds of the forest, so soothing during the day, now seemed sharper, more deliberate. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt closer, like something was moving just out of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was simply unused to being so far from civilization. I forced myself to crawl into my tent and try to sleep. The first night passed uneventfully, though I slept poorly. Every little noise outside the thin walls of my tent kept me on edge. I woke up early, the first light of dawn barely filtering through the trees. I made coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to explore a bit before heading back to the main trail. There was something about the area that intrigued me, despite the unease I had felt the night before. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, snacks, and my map. I figured I'd be back in a couple of hours. The narrow trail continued deeper into the forest, winding through dense thickets and up gentle slopes. I marked my path as I went, tying small pieces of bright orange tape to branches to ensure I wouldn't get lost. The air was cooler here, the canopy above so thick that barely any sunlight reached the forest floor. It was beautiful in a wild and untamed way. After about an hour of walking, I came across something strange. The trail seemed to disappear into a steep ravine, its sides lined with jagged rocks and dense undergrowth. At the bottom, I could see a small stream trickling through the shadows. There was no clear way to cross, and the idea of climbing down and back up the other side seemed risky. As I stood there, considering my options, I felt a prickle of unease again. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I decided to turn back, retracing my steps carefully. But as I walked, I realized something was off. The pieces of orange tape I had tied to mark my path were gone. Not broken or fallen, but completely gone, as if someone had removed them. My stomach twisted. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I must have made a mistake, that I had missed a turn or tied the markers too loosely. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Panic began to creep in as I searched for any sign of the trail back to my campsite. The forest felt alien now, the once familiar path seeming to shift and change around me. I checked my map, but it was useless without the trail markers. The GPS on my phone showed nothing but a blank screen, the dense canopy above blocking any signal. I was lost. Hours passed as I wandered, my sense of direction growing more and more confused. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, the shadows stretching longer and darker. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, but the fear was growing. I had enough supplies to last the night, but the idea of spending another night alone in this increasingly hostile forest filled me with dread. As the light faded, I stumbled across a small clearing. It wasn't my campsite, but it was flat and open enough to set up for the night. I pitched my tent quickly, my hands shaking, and gathered some wood for a fire. The flames brought little comfort this time, their light only emphasizing the darkness pressing in around me. I ate a cold meal, too anxious to bother with cooking, and sat by the fire, listening. Every sound seemed amplified now, every rustle or crack a potential threat. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember when. I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent, close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to listen. It didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I circled the tent once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I stayed frozen, clutching the small camping knife I kept by my sleeping bag, until the first light of dawn began to seep through the tent walls. When I finally dared to look outside, there was nothing there. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something or someone had been out there. I didn't waste any time packing up. I needed to get out of there, to find my way back to the main trail and leave the forest behind. But no matter which direction I chose, the trees all looked the same, the paths indistinguishable from one another. It felt like the forest was deliberately keeping me in, its dense foliage and twisting trails forming a maze with no exit. By midday, I was exhausted and disoriented, my water running low. The forest seemed to close in around me, the once beautiful scenery now oppressive and menacing. I was starting to lose hope when I heard it, the faint sound of running water. It was the first sound I'd heard all day that wasn't my own footsteps or the occasional bird call. I followed it, desperate for some sign of civilization or at least a landmark. The stream led me to a larger clearing, where I found something that both relieved and terrified me. A weathered wooden sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The letters were faded, but I could just make out the words, trailhead, and an arrow pointing left. I wasn't far from safety after all. But the relief was short-lived. Beside the sign, partially hidden in the tall grass, was a backpack. It was torn and weathered, as if it had been there for months. The contents were scattered, the fabric stained with something dark and dried. My stomach churned as I realized what it meant. Someone else had been lost here, and they hadn't made it out. I didn't stop to think. I followed the arrow, forcing myself to move despite the fear clawing at my mind. The trail was faint, barely more than a game trail, but it was something. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the growing sense of being watched. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running would only lead to more mistakes, more chances to lose the trail. When I finally saw the parking lot, the sight felt unreal, like a mirage. My car was still there, untouched, the only vehicle left. I didn't waste a second. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the forest. I never reported what I found. I couldn't bring myself to relive it, to explain what had happened to anyone. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I've never gone camping alone again, and I never will. I never considered myself much of a camper, but I always liked the idea of disconnecting from everything, leaving behind the constant buzz of phones, emails, and social media. So, when my friend Tim lent me his gear and suggested I try a solo camping trip, I decided to give it a shot. I planned meticulously, poring over maps, reading forums, and making lists of essentials. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was something I felt prepared for. At least I thought I was. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, about a 4-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. It was far enough to feel secluded, but not so remote that I'd be completely off the grid. The route was marked as moderate, and with decent weather predicted, I figured I could handle it. I packed food, water, a first aid kit, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a headlamp. Tim's gear, a reliable pack and lightweight stove, completed my setup. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car, double-checked my map, and set out around mid-morning. The trail was well-maintained, winding through dense forest with occasional clearings that offered views of rolling hills and distant peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. By early afternoon, I reached a small stream, my halfway point. I stopped to refill my water bottle using the filter Tim had lent me and ate a quick lunch of trail mix and an energy bar. The sound of the water was soothing, and for a moment, I thought about just staying there. But the spot I had chosen to camp was supposed to be near a small lake, and I was eager to see it. The last leg of the hike was harder than I expected. The trail grew steeper and narrower, and the trees closed in, blocking out much of the sunlight. I noticed the silence more here. The occasional bird call or rustle of leaves had been comforting earlier, but now the quiet felt heavy. I kept moving, focusing on each step, until finally, I saw the lake through the trees. It wasn't large, maybe a couple 100 feet across, but the water was clear and still, reflecting the dark green of the surrounding forest. It was beautiful. I found a flat spot a short distance from the lake and set up my tent. The process took longer than it should have. The stakes didn't want to go into the rocky ground, and I realized I'd forgotten how to adjust the rainfly. By the time everything was in place, the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some wood for a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat watching the flames as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. The first night went smoothly. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside the tent, but it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. I fell back asleep quickly and woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. After breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area, following animal trails, and sitting by the lake. The sense of solitude was exhilarating, but as the day wore on, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just a growing awareness of how alone I was. That night, the unease grew stronger. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, something splashing in the lake. I told myself it was just wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed up later than I planned, shining my headlamp into the trees whenever I heard something. The beam of light revealed nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Finally, I convinced myself to lie down and try to sleep. I woke up abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. The air inside the tent felt cold, and I could hear the wind picking up outside. Then I heard it, a distinct sound, different from the rustling of leaves or the creaking of trees. It was a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was faint, but it was there. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept in my pack. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside cautiously. The forest looked the same as it had the day before, peaceful, untouched. There were no signs of anyone else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. Packing up took longer than usual. My hands were shaking, and I kept stopping to listen for any sounds. The hike back was grueling. Every noise, the rustle of leaves, the call of a bird, made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The trail that had felt welcoming 2 days ago now seemed oppressive, the trees closing in on all sides. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I realized my hands were still trembling. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, heightened by being alone in an unfamiliar place. Maybe the footsteps were just an animal. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me. I haven't been camping since. I've always loved camping. The smell of pine trees, the rustle of leaves, the crackling campfire. It's a way to escape the chaos of everyday life and find some peace. Last summer, I planned a solo camping trip to a remote area in the Pacific Northwest. I wanted solitude, just me, the wilderness, and the quiet. I got all of that and more than I bargained for. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. The gravel road wound through dense forests and along steep cliffs. My car bounced and rattled over the rough terrain, but I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the small clearing where the trail began, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I strapped on my backpack, double-checked my map and compass, and headed into the forest. The trail was narrow and overgrown, clearly not well-traveled. That was a good sign. I wanted to be far from the usual camping spots. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant hum of highways, no voices, no signs of human presence. Just the rustling leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. The water was clear and cold, shaded by overhanging branches. The ground was soft and flat, ideal for pitching a tent. I set up my camp quickly, arranging my gear and gathering firewood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire going and was boiling water for a dehydrated meal. That first night was uneventful. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds. The chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustle of leaves. I fell asleep to the soothing rhythm of the stream. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small pack with essentials: water, snacks, a map, and a knife. The forest was thick, the trees towering high above, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. I followed the stream for a while, then veered off into the woods, marking my path with small ribbons of biodegradable tape. It felt like true wilderness. No trails, no signs, just endless trees and underbrush. Around midday, I stumbled upon something odd. It was a pile of stones, stacked deliberately in the middle of a small clearing. They weren't particularly large or unusual, but their arrangement felt intentional. I paused, staring at the pile. It didn't seem natural, but I couldn't figure out why anyone would be out here stacking rocks. I shrugged it off as a strange coincidence and moved on. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I'd wandered farther than I intended. The shadows were growing longer, and the light had taken on that golden hue that signaled the approach of evening. I turned back, following my marked path, but something felt off. The forest seemed darker, quieter. Even the birds were silent. The air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally reached my campsite, the fire pit was disturbed. The rocks I had arranged in a circle were scattered, and the ashes from the previous night were spread across the ground. My first thought was animals, but it didn't add up. I'd seen no tracks, no signs of wildlife large enough to cause this. My gut told me something else was going on, but I tried to push the thought aside. I rebuilt the fire pit, lit a new fire, and sat close to it as the night settled in. The sounds of the forest were there, but they seemed distant, muffled. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The second night was restless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. At some point, exhaustion won, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke up just before dawn to a strange noise. It was faint, a distant rustling, followed by a sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the shifting light of the fire. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed up my camp. I decided to cut my trip short. The unease I felt wasn't something I could shake. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different, almost hostile. The trees seemed to close in, and the trail that had been so clear before now felt confusing, almost unfamiliar. About halfway back, I found another pile of stones, similar to the one I'd seen the day before. This one was larger, and there were small sticks arranged around it in a strange pattern. It stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were comforting. That's when I heard it. A faint whistle, high and melodic, coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a bird. It was too deliberate, too human. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to find out who or what was making that sound. I turned and practically ran down the trail, my pack bouncing against my back. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept moving, pushing myself harder than I'd ever pushed before. The whistling came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but it never stopped entirely. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd left my car, I was drenched in sweat and my legs felt like jelly. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a paved road, surrounded by the reassuring signs of civilization. Only then did I pull over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had I stumbled into out there? Who or what had been watching me? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I won't be camping alone again. That trip left its mark on me. I still love the outdoors, but the idea of total isolation doesn't hold the same appeal. Sometimes, I wake up at night to the sound of a faint whistle in my dreams, and I'm back in that forest, running, searching for safety. It's a reminder that the wilderness is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. And sometimes, it's best to respect the unknown and keep your distance. I'll never forget that camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect from work and unwind in the woods. I had planned it for weeks, scouring maps for the perfect spot. Isolated but not too remote, scenic but accessible by foot. The place I settled on was a small clearing near a stream, tucked deep within a dense forest. The hike to get there was about 5 miles from the parking lot, challenging enough to keep casual hikers away, but not so grueling as to deter someone reasonably fit like me. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon on a Saturday. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of early autumn weather that makes you feel alive. Leaves crunched underfoot as I shouldered my pack and started up the trail. The woods were vibrant with color, golden yellows, fiery reds, and burnt oranges, and the scent of pine mingled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. For a while, everything felt perfect. The trail was well marked but narrow, winding through groves of towering trees that seemed to close in as I moved deeper into the forest. I passed a few hikers heading back the way I came, exchanging nods and polite smiles but little else. By the time I reached my destination, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I found the clearing exactly as it had appeared in the photos, a flat patch of grass surrounded by trees, with the gentle murmur of the stream just beyond. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was soft but dry. The stream was close enough to provide water for cooking and cleaning, but far enough that its sound wouldn't drown out other noises. After pitching the tent, I gathered some firewood and built a small campfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, eating a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and the forest around me seemed to hum with life. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to change. The vibrant colors of the day were replaced by deep, impenetrable black. My fire was the only source of light, and beyond its glow, the world was a void. I'm not someone who scares easily, but there's something about being alone in the woods at night that's inherently unsettling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, seemed magnified. I told myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly and that the morning light would banish the unease I felt. Inside the tent, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The sounds outside seemed louder than before. I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of the forest, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I woke with a start in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet now, eerily so. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound was coming from the direction of the stream, moving closer. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, but deep down I knew better. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the darkness. When I finally turned it on, the beam of light pierced the tent, casting an eerie glow. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, sweeping the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. The forest was still and silent, the shadows long and menacing. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, flashlight in hand, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was imagining things. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though I didn't dare turn off the flashlight. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. By the time I finally drifted off again, the first light of dawn was creeping into the sky. The next morning, I emerged from the tent feeling groggy and on edge. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but the unease lingered. I decided to stay one more night, reasoning that I was probably overreacting. After all, there was no evidence that anything or anyone had been near my campsite. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream upstream to a small waterfall, and then venturing into the woods to collect more firewood. The hike helped clear my head, and by the time I returned to camp, I was feeling more at ease. I rebuilt the fire and cooked a proper meal, pasta with canned sauce and a bit of jerky for protein. As the sun set, I settled in by the fire, determined to enjoy the solitude. But as night fell, the unease returned. The forest seemed darker than the night before, the shadows deeper. I stayed by the fire longer this time, feeding it more wood to keep it burning brightly. I didn't want to go to bed, but eventually, fatigue won out. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. I woke again in the middle of the night, this time to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a faint metallic clinking, coming from the direction of my pack. My heart pounded as I realized what it was. Someone was rummaging through my gear. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light swept across the clearing, illuminating my pack, which lay a few feet from the fire pit. It was open, its contents scattered, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in one hand and the small camping knife I kept for emergencies in the other. My breath was visible in the cold night air, and the forest was silent except for the pounding of my heart. I approached the pack cautiously, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. When I reached the pack, I saw that some of my food was missing. A couple of granola bars and a bag of trail mix, but everything else seemed untouched. I packed it back up and returned to the tent, locking the zippers together with a small carabiner. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. By the time dawn arrived, I had made up my mind to leave. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, stuffing everything haphazardly into my pack. The clearing looked almost serene in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The hike back to the car was grueling. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car sitting exactly where I had left it. I tossed my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't until I got home and started unpacking that I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Inside the main compartment of my pack, tucked among my clothes, was a piece of paper I hadn't put there. It was folded neatly, and when I opened it, I saw a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting. "You were lucky this time. I don't know who left the note or how they got into my pack without me noticing, but I've never gone camping alone again. It started as a simple weekend getaway. My plan was to spend 2 nights in the woods, alone with my thoughts, my gear, and the wilderness. I had been stressed at work and needed the quiet that only nature could provide. I'd chosen a spot about 3 hours from the city, a national forest that wasn't too popular but still well maintained. I packed my backpack meticulously. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I also carried a GPS device, a map, and a fully charged phone just in case. The drive out was uneventful, just winding roads through small towns and dense forest. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was early afternoon. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. It felt good to be away from the city noise. I checked my map one last time, strapped on my pack, and began the hike to my chosen campsite. It was about 4 miles in, near a small, secluded lake. The first 2 miles were easy. The trail was well marked, and the terrain wasn't too challenging. I passed a few other hikers heading back toward the trailhead, exchanging polite nods but not stopping to chat. By the time I reached the halfway point, the trail began to narrow, and the forest grew denser. The sounds of the modern world faded, replaced by birdsong, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I reached the lake just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. It was as beautiful as I had hoped, a mirror-like expanse of water surrounded by towering pines. The only sign of human presence was an old fire ring, its stones blackened with soot. I chose a flat spot about 20 yards from the shore to set up my tent. The process was methodical, almost meditative. By the time I finished, the sun had set and the sky was awash with stars. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the lake's edge, and stared at the stars until my neck ached. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost instantly. The sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl were like a lullaby. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the lake. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and my GPS device and set out. The morning was cool, but the sun quickly warmed the air. I followed a faint trail that wound around the lake and then veered off into the woods. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel both insignificant and deeply connected to the world. As I walked, I began to notice small things that seemed out of place. A pile of branches stacked unnaturally against a tree. A single boot, caked in mud, lying in the underbrush. At first, I dismissed these as remnants of past campers or hunters. People leave all sorts of things in the woods. But as the day went on, the oddities became harder to ignore. A rusted canteen hanging from a low branch. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a bush. The trail eventually led me to a clearing. In the center was a dilapidated cabin, its roof partially caved in and its windows dark. It wasn't on any map I'd seen, and I hesitated before approaching. Something about the cabin felt off, like it didn't belong there, but curiosity won out and I stepped closer. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of rot. The floor was littered with debris, old newspapers, broken furniture, animal droppings. In one corner, a pile of ashes suggested someone had once built a fire here. I didn't linger. The place gave me the creeps. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was low in the sky. I felt uneasy but couldn't quite put my finger on why. I hadn't seen another person all day, and the forest, so serene in the morning, now seemed to press in on me. Shadows stretched long and dark across the ground. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me whip my head around. I told myself I was just letting my imagination run wild. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, It was natural to feel a little on edge. I cooked dinner, but my appetite was gone. The food tasted like ash in my mouth. When night fell, I built a small fire, hoping it would bring some comfort. Didn't. The darkness beyond the firelight felt impenetrable, and the forest seemed too quiet. I decided to turn in early. My tent felt claustrophobic, but at least it was a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I lay awake for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I woke up to a noise, a sharp, cracking sound, like a branch snapping underfoot. My eyes flew open, and I held my breath, straining to hear. Another crack, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. When I finally turned it on, the beam of light illuminated the inside of my tent, but nothing beyond. The noises stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The daylight made everything feel safer, less menacing. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to get back to the trailhead and the safety of my car. As I hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my pack into the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands trembling. As I drove away, I felt a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. But even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I can't explain the things I saw or the feelings I had. I don't know what, if anything, was out there. But one thing is certain, I won't be going back. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, far from the hum of city life, that makes everything seem simpler. Last summer, I decided to go solo camping. I'd done it before, so I wasn't nervous. I'd packed my gear, planned my route, and picked a spot deep in a national forest that wasn't too far from home. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend with just me, my thoughts, and nature. Couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The drive had been uneventful, and the parking lot was empty, as expected. Most people didn't venture this far out. That's what I liked about it. After locking up my car, I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and set off down the trail. The air was cool, the scent of pine strong, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional chirp of a bird. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 4 miles. The trail was well marked, weaving through thick woods and along the edge of a small creek. I took my time, stopping occasionally to take pictures or sip water. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the ground, and everything felt calm. I remember thinking how perfect the day was. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The spot was ideal. A flat patch of ground surrounded by trees, with the creek nearby for water. I quickly set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started gathering firewood. By dusk, I had a small fire crackling, and the warmth felt good as the temperature began to drop. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and sat by the fire, eating and watching the flames dance. The forest around me was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant gurgle of the creek. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd come for. As the night deepened, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light. I felt safe and content, the kind of tired that comes from a day spent outdoors. Before long, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, eerily so. No wind, no insects, nothing. I lay still, straining to hear. Then I caught it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from somewhere outside my tent. My mind raced. Animals were common in the woods, but this sounded too deliberate to be a deer or raccoon. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent door as quietly as I could. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. The crunching had stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, though my heart was still racing. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and noticed something odd. Around the campsite, the ground was disturbed. It looked like someone or something had been walking in circles. The prints were faint, but they were there. I couldn't tell if they were human or animal, but they made me uneasy. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I'd made them the night before without realizing it. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking to a nearby hill that offered a stunning view of the forest below. The uneasiness from the morning lingered but faded as the day wore on. By the time I returned to camp, I was tired but in good spirits. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for the evening. The night felt calmer, and I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the previous night. But then it happened again. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke to that same crunching sound. This time it was closer. My flashlight was within reach, and I grabbed it, sitting up in my sleeping bag. The sound stopped the moment I moved. My tent felt suffocatingly small. I held my breath, listening. Then, from just outside, I heard the faintest rustle, as if someone or something was brushing against the fabric of my tent. I'm not proud of what I did next. I froze. I'd like to think I'd be braver, but at that moment, fear pinned me in place. The rustling stopped after a few seconds, and everything went silent again. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my flashlight, but eventually exhaustion took over. When morning came, I found more disturbed ground around the campsite. This time, there were clear footprints, human, not animal. My stomach sank. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. Someone had been out there, walking around my camp while I slept. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I'd come out here to relax, to escape. I told myself it was probably just a hiker who'd stumbled upon my camp and left when they saw it was occupied. It didn't make much sense, but I clung to the thought. I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder as I explored a nearby stream and collected firewood. When evening came, I built the biggest fire I could manage, hoping it would deter anyone from approaching. I kept my hatchet within arm's reach and stayed up late, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Around midnight, the sounds started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard twigs snapping, branches rustling, and what sounded like faint, deliberate movements in the underbrush. Whoever was out there wasn't trying very hard to stay quiet. I couldn't take it anymore. I yelled into the darkness, telling whoever it was to leave me alone. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The noises stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then, just as I was beginning to think they were gone, I heard it. A low, guttural cough, coming from somewhere just beyond the light of the fire. That was it. I grabbed my pack, shoved what I could into it, and doused the fire with water. The embers hissed as I stomped them out. I didn't bother packing everything. I just wanted to leave. With my flashlight in one hand and my hatchet in the other, I started down the trail. The hike back to the car was the longest 4 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it felt like the shadows were closing in around me. I've never been so relieved as when I finally saw the glint of my car's windows through the trees. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, my headlights swept across the trailhead, illuminating a figure standing at the edge of the woods. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but they didn't move as I drove away. They just stood there watching. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. I made it home safely, but the experience left a mark. I haven't been camping since. Looking back, I've tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just some weirdo messing with me, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is that I'll never take the solitude of the wilderness for granted again. Sometimes, being alone isn't as safe as it seems. The drive to the cabin was long and uneventful, a straight shot through the winding, empty roads of the backwoods. My car hummed steadily, the only sound besides the occasional crunch of tires over loose gravel. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, a break from the city, from work, from people. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin itself sat at the end of a dirt trail, tucked into the forest like a secret. It was small and unassuming, with faded wooden walls and a sloping roof. The surrounding trees were dense and tall, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. As I stepped out of the car, the air hit me, crisp, cold, and smelling faintly of pine. I felt a shiver run through me, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. This was what I needed. Isolation, quiet, a chance to clear my head. The interior of the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a small kitchenette, and a fireplace in the corner. There was a bathroom, thankfully, but no running water. A large metal basin and a few buckets suggested I'd need to fetch water from the nearby stream. I'd read about it in the listing, but hadn't given it much thought until now. Unpacking didn't take long. I'd brought the essentials: food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a few books. I set everything up quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. The light in the forest was already starting to fade, casting long shadows across the ground. By the time I had the small kerosene lantern lit and placed on the table, the cabin felt cozy in a way that made me smile. I hadn't smiled much in the past few months. This felt good. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some instant noodles on the portable stove and read by the light of the lantern until my eyes grew heavy. Outside, the forest was alive with sound: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was a comforting kind of noise, like the world was reminding me it was still there, even in the middle of nowhere. I fell asleep easily, the thin mattress surprisingly comfortable. The next morning, I woke up early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the small window above the bed. The air was colder than I expected, my breath visible in small puffs as I moved around the cabin. I dressed quickly, layering up against the chill, and decided to explore the area a bit before breakfast. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. The trees seemed taller, their bark rough and textured beneath my fingertips. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of moss and damp wood. I followed a faint trail that led away from the cabin, winding deeper into the woods. It wasn't long before I found the stream mentioned in the listing. It was narrow but fast-moving, the water clear and cold. I crouched down to fill one of the buckets I'd brought, watching as the sunlight danced on the surface. As I stood up, bucket in hand, I noticed something strange: a series of scratches on a tree trunk nearby. They were deep and uneven, like something had clawed at the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over them. They didn't look like they'd been made by an animal, at least not any animal I could think of. They were too deliberate, too human. Shaking off the unease creeping up my spine, I made my way back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I spent most of it reading, only venturing outside to gather more water or stretch my legs. The scratches on the tree lingered in the back of my mind, but I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. Probably just some bored hiker or a prank from the locals. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I'd managed to convince myself it was nothing. That night, the forest felt different. The sounds that had lulled me to sleep the night before seemed distant, almost muted. I told myself it was just the wind, the temperature dropping as the night set in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I double-checked the lock on the door before climbing into bed, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I stared at them until sleep finally took me. A noise woke me in the middle of the night, a sharp, distinct sound that cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't the creak of the cabin settling or the rustle of leaves outside. It was closer, louder. My heart was pounding as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was coming from outside. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Maybe it was a branch falling or an animal rummaging around. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just beyond the cabin. First, I didn't see anything. Then, movement, a shadow shifting just out of reach of the flashlight's glow. My breath caught. It was too big to be an animal. Human, then, but who and why? Panic surged through me as I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Call out? No, that would be stupid. I didn't even have cell service out here. I locked the door earlier, I was sure of it. But the windows, they didn't have locks, just flimsy latches. I decided to wait it out. Whoever it was, they'd move on. They had to. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, ears straining for any sign of movement. The sound of my own breathing was deafening, every creak of the cabin making me jump. Hours seemed to pass before I finally drifted off again, exhaustion overriding fear. When morning came, the first thing I did was check outside. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed ground. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream. But I knew better. The unease from the previous day was back, stronger now. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. I spent the day preparing to leave. I packed up my things, made sure the car was ready to go, and even filled an extra gas can just in case. But as the sun began to set, I realized I'd have to spend one more night here. Driving these roads in the dark was a risk I wasn't willing to take. That final night was the worst. The noises started again, soft at first, then louder, more deliberate. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow and measured. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. At one point, I thought I heard the faint sound of breathing, close enough to make my skin crawl. But I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the noises stopped and silence returned. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn broke, I didn't waste any time. I threw my bags in the car and started the engine, the relief almost overwhelming as I pulled away from the cabin. The drive back to civilization felt like it took forever, the narrow forest roads stretching on endlessly. But when I finally saw the highway up ahead, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the scratches. They were on the car this time, deep grooves etched into the paint of the driver's side door. My stomach dropped as I stared at them, the memories of the past 2 nights flooding back. Whatever had been out there hadn't just been watching me. It had been closer than I'd thought. I never reported it. What would I even say? Instead, I put the whole experience behind me, vowing never to set foot in that forest again. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of everyday life. Instead, it became a reminder of how fragile that peace can be and how quickly it can be shattered. The sun had just started to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail. I had been hiking alone for the past 3 hours, steadily making my way through the dense forest that lined the base of the hills. It was the kind of afternoon where the air is cool, crisp, and filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. I had done this hike many times before, but today something felt off. I had set out early in the morning, eager to conquer a trail I had heard about but never ventured on myself. The path was supposed to be challenging, with steep inclines and rocky passages, but that didn't bother me. I was used to hiking alone. Being out in nature was when I felt most at peace. The rhythmic sound of my boots hitting the dirt, the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees, and the soft chirps of birds in the distance. It all put me in a place of calm. But today was different. I couldn't put my finger on it. The woods felt denser, darker somehow. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was never anyone there, just the trees and the rocks. I stopped for a moment to take a swig from my water bottle, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. Sweat dripped down my neck, the cool breeze offering a little relief from the effort of the climb. I glanced up at the sky. The clouds had started to roll in, thick and gray, blotting out the sun entirely. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, and a sense of unease settled over me. Pushing forward, I continued along the trail, which now narrowed into a single path between thick underbrush. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots was louder now, and the wind was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees like a warning. It was strange, considering I hadn't seen a single sign of wildlife in hours. No squirrels, no birds, not even the occasional rustle of a deer in the distance. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. A piece of fabric, a torn, faded red cloth, was caught on a branch. At first, I thought it was just trash, but as I drew closer, I noticed it didn't seem right. It looked like it had been there for a while. The cloth was frayed at the edges, like it had been torn from something, and there was dirt and moss clinging to it as if it had been caught in the branches for days. I reached out and gently tugged at it, but it didn't come loose easily. Something about it made me hesitate. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of the fabric, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up my spine. I let go of it and stepped back, my eyes scanning the trees around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like someone or something was watching me. I shrugged it off as my imagination getting the better of me. After all, this was just a trail in the woods. People must hike it all the time, right? I continued on, but the atmosphere felt heavier now. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. It felt like the world had gone still, as though the very forest was holding its breath. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding through the trees, the path becoming steeper and rockier. My legs ached with each step, but I pressed on, eager to reach the summit. My goal was simple: to see the view from the top and feel that rush of accomplishment. I needed that release, but the further I went, the more I started to feel disoriented. The path didn't look familiar anymore. I had hiked this trail before, yet the trees seemed to change around me, becoming more twisted, more gnarled. The light was fading quickly, and I knew I needed to make a decision: turn back or push on. I checked my watch. It was almost 6 p.m. I hadn't planned on being out this late, but I felt stubborn. I was so close to the summit, just a little further. As I kept climbing, My sense of direction started to slip. I had always been good at navigating, but now it was as though the trail was playing tricks on me. The trees looked different, the rocks seemed unfamiliar. I reached for my map, but when I pulled it out, I found that I couldn't make sense of it. The markings on it didn't align with what I saw in front of me. The path that should have been straight ahead twisted off to the side, leading into an area I knew I hadn't passed through before. Panic began to creep in, but I refused to let it take over. I had hiked in the woods many times. I knew how to get out. I just needed to calm down and think clearly. I stopped for a moment, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. My heart was pounding now, and the air felt colder. I was alone, and for the first time I started to feel the weight of that isolation. The kind of isolation that sinks into your bones, making everything seem more sinister than it really is. I took another look at the map, trying to figure out where I was. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I glanced around, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, just the wind whispering through the branches. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Someone was out there, watching me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but the feeling didn't go away. I was being watched. I had to get moving. Turning back, I retraced my steps, hoping to find the trail I'd missed. But the woods now seemed to close in on me, as though the trees were pressing closer, their twisted limbs reaching out to grab me. Every step I took felt heavier, the ground beneath my boots uneven and treacherous. The shadows were long now, and the fading light made everything look distorted, like I was walking through a dream. Then I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible through the underbrush, was a small clearing. It wasn't part of the trail. It was too open, too unnervingly quiet. And in the center of the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of boots. They were still just sitting there in the middle of the clearing, as if abandoned. They weren't facing me, and there was no sign of the person who had been wearing them. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who else could be out here? The only other person I'd seen on the trail was a hiker hours ago. But that was it. I hadn't passed anyone since. I slowly took a few steps toward the clearing, my body tense. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't look away from those boots. I had to know. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave their boots here, alone in the woods? As I got closer, I saw something else. Something that made my stomach churn. A piece of clothing caught on a branch. It was the same red cloth I had seen earlier. But it wasn't just fabric. It was torn, jagged, like someone had been pulled through the bushes in a hurry. My mind raced. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I took a step back, suddenly desperate to get out of there. Then I heard something. A sound in the distance. A low, guttural growl. I froze. This wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human. The sound came again, closer this time, and my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a growl at all. It was the sound of someone struggling, gasping for breath. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My legs pumped furiously, the sound of my breath in my ears drowning out everything else. I had to get off this trail. I had to get back to the parking lot where I knew I'd be safe. I didn't stop running until I reached the familiar markers of the trailhead, the sounds of the forest growing distant behind me. When I finally emerged from the woods, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, I was met with the sight of my car parked in the lot. I didn't hesitate for a second. I jumped into the driver's seat and sped off without a second glance at the woods. The night felt heavy on my shoulders, but I was safe, for now. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the image of those abandoned boots in the clearing. Something had happened out there, and whatever it was far from over. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains as I began my hike. I had been planning this for weeks, wanting to escape the city for a few days and find some peace in the wilderness. Just me, the forest, and the fresh air. It was supposed to be an easy trail, nothing too demanding. I had read up on it, checked all the maps, and packed light. The weather was supposed to be clear, the trail manageable, and the whole experience just a relaxing getaway. I didn't know then how quickly it would go from peaceful to something else entirely. The path was well maintained, wide enough to make the journey comfortable. The trees around me were tall, thick, their branches casting long shadows as the sun sank lower. Birds flitted in and out of sight, the occasional rustling of leaves making me feel like I was in a living, breathing world, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. I moved with an easy pace, taking in the sights, the soft crunch of my boots on the gravel path, the sound of distant water trickling somewhere far below, and the scent of pine and earth. I felt alive in a way that only nature could make me feel. But there was something in the air that I couldn't shake. A quiet unease, like a thin thread of tension weaving through the calm. Maybe it was just my imagination, nothing more than the wind or the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But there were moments when the rustling stopped suddenly, when the forest seemed to go completely still, as though it was holding its breath. As the trail narrowed and the trees thickened, I noticed the trail markers were becoming more spaced out. It was subtle at first, but then it became impossible to ignore. The trees were beginning to look more alike, each one an identical sentinel, tall and looming, their trunks rough and knotted. And the further I went, the harder it was to tell where I was. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But it was hard not to notice how the shadows were stretching longer, how the air had grown cooler. The sun was almost gone now, only a faint light clinging to the horizon. My phone had no signal out here, so I couldn't rely on it for navigation. I looked around, trying to find the next marker, but I couldn't spot anything. My heart began to beat a little faster. I stopped for a moment, trying to regain my composure. I had read that getting lost on this trail wasn't unheard of. People had made it out just fine, so I wasn't too worried. I turned around, expecting to see the familiar markers of the trail I had just walked, but the path behind me looked different. It wasn't just the angle or the shadows. There was something distinctly wrong about it. The trees seemed to have shifted, blocking my view of the trail I had just come from. I couldn't even remember which direction I had taken. A few moments passed before I realized how much I was starting to panic. I tried to calm myself down, taking deep breaths. I had hiked alone before. I'd always been careful to stay on the path. There was no need to freak out, but my mind wasn't cooperating. I felt trapped in the woods, surrounded by these towering trees that didn't seem to know where I was supposed to go. I retraced my steps as best I could, but the more I looked, the more the trail seemed to have disappeared. The underbrush was thicker now, the ground uneven. Every step felt like it was pulling me further away from the world I knew. I should have turned back earlier. The light was almost gone when I finally gave in to the fact that I was lost. I tried to find the trail again, scanning for any sign, but nothing stood out. I hadn't seen another soul since I started, and now I was alone in a place that was starting to feel hostile. The weight of the silence pressed in on me. The sky was getting darker, and the forest felt deeper and more foreign by the minute. I had no choice but to find shelter. I couldn't risk walking in the dark, and I wasn't about to spend the night on the forest floor with nothing but my jacket and a backpack full of snacks. My mind raced, trying to think of the best course of action. I thought about turning back again, but I wasn't sure where the trail was anymore. So I picked a direction, any direction, and walked. The woods felt different now. The trees weren't just tall and silent anymore. They were oppressive, looming over me like silent watchers. The wind had picked up, whipping through the leaves in a way that sounded unnatural, almost as though it was trying to get my attention. The rustling wasn't just the wind anymore. It was more like something moving through the trees, shifting just out of sight. I glanced around quickly, but saw nothing. Still, the sense that I wasn't alone gnawed at me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone there. But there was no one. The forest had grown colder, and my breath was visible in the dimming light. My pace quickened, my boots crunching against the frozen earth now. I could feel the panic creeping back into my chest, and I tried to force it down. It was irrational. I was just in the woods, a bit off track, but I could find my way. Still, my mind wasn't hearing any of it. I had to get out of there. The trail markers were gone, but something else appeared. It was subtle, something that could have been easily overlooked if I wasn't looking so desperately for any sign of direction. There was a faint indentation in the earth, a path that hadn't been there before, just off to the side. Without much thought, I followed it, moving as quickly as I dared. The ground grew softer, the trees thinning out, and I began to feel that maybe I was on the right path after all. And then, as if in answer to my silent pleas, I saw the first glimpse of light. It wasn't much at first. A small break in the canopy above, just enough for the last sliver of the sun to break through and light up the dirt trail ahead. The forest felt a little less dense now, the air fresher. My pace slowed, the anxiety in my chest loosening with every step. I followed the new path, each step seeming more confident than the last, until I finally reached the clearing. I stumbled out of the woods and into a wide, open space. There, just ahead, was a cabin. It was small, weathered but sturdy looking, nestled at the edge of a steep hill. There was a faint light glowing from the window, a warm, inviting sight in the growing dark. I was shaken, exhausted, but the sense of relief flooded through me. I didn't care how far I had wandered, or how lost I had been. I had found my way back. I made my way toward the cabin, knocking hesitantly on the door. An older man answered, his face full of surprise but softened by a kindness that made me feel welcome. He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because without hesitation, he let me inside, offering me hot tea and a place to rest. It turned out this cabin had been his for years, tucked away from the main trail, only accessible by small, forgotten paths like the one I had stumbled upon. He spoke about the woods like a familiar friend, one that had seen many travelers like me get turned around. He offered some advice on how to better navigate the trails for next time, and after a long night of rest, I left the cabin at dawn, following the trail markers carefully and steadily until I finally emerged back onto the main path. It wasn't the peaceful getaway I had planned, but it was a reminder that sometimes the wilderness, with all its beauty and serenity, could turn on you in the blink of an eye. I left that mountain with a new respect for its power and the quiet wisdom that comes from knowing just how easy it is to lose yourself, and just how important it is to find your way back. I've always liked the idea of getting away from everything, of being alone with my thoughts. So when I found a cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles from any town, it felt like the perfect escape. No one around, just nature, peace, and quiet. I didn't even hesitate when I saw the ad online. The listing made it sound ideal. A secluded, rustic cabin for rent for a week, perfect for solitude. It was more affordable than I expected, too, which only made it more tempting. I packed my things, clothes, some books, a few snacks, and hit the road. I didn't bother telling anyone where I was going. It wasn't like I was planning anything special, just a week to clear my head. The drive itself was peaceful, the kind of drive where the world outside the window looks like a postcard. As I got further from civilization, I felt a kind of excitement building up inside me. It wasn't until I turned off the main road that things started to feel different. The gravel path leading to the cabin was rough, more of a trail than a proper road. The trees crowded in on either side, their branches intertwining like they were trying to block out the sunlight. The air felt heavier here, like it had been untouched for years, maybe even centuries. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. The wooden structure sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The cabin was simple: a small porch with a rocking chair, a slanted roof, and windows with faded curtains. The front door was unlocked, just like they said in the listing. I walked inside and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The inside was cozy, yet there was something off about it. The walls were paneled with dark wood, and a stone fireplace stood at the far end of the room. There were old wooden beams across the ceiling, and the furniture looked aged but sturdy. A small kitchen area was tucked to one side, complete with a gas stove and a rusty fridge. I unpacked my bags, set up my things on the small table by the window, and made myself a cup of coffee. The silence outside was deafening. No birds, no wind, just nothing. It felt unnerving, but I brushed it off. I had the whole week ahead of me. That night, I sat by the fireplace, reading a book by the soft glow of a single lamp. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room, and the longer I sat there, the more the silence outside seemed to creep in. Every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. It wasn't even a natural darkness. It felt thick, almost suffocating, as though something was hiding out there. I tried not to let my mind wander, but there were noises, subtle at first, like twigs snapping underfoot or a faint rustle in the trees. Could have been animals, I told myself. But the air was so still, so unnaturally quiet, that I found it hard to believe. The first night passed uneventfully, and I managed to fall asleep in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. The bed was soft, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. I was alone, far away from the chaos of everyday life. I told myself I was being silly, but deep down, something gnawed at me. The next day, I decided to explore. I grabbed my camera and headed out the front door, walking along the trail that led deeper into the woods. The trees were thick here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, the kind you'd expect to see in a forest that had been standing for centuries. The air was dense with the smell of pine and damp earth. I followed the trail for a good while, taking photos of the strange beauty of the place. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the way the world felt so far away. But then, I noticed something strange. The trail started to fork, leading off into different directions, and each path felt more unnatural than the last. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches reaching out like arms trying to pull me in. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. That's when I saw it. Something in the distance. A figure, barely visible between the trees, standing completely still. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart began to race. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. The woods felt oppressive now, like they were closing in on me, the air thick with a kind of waiting. That night, things got worse. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard something outside. It was a sound I hadn't heard before, soft, almost like a whisper. I stood up and walked to the window, my hand gripping the edge of the curtain. Nothing, just the darkness. But the feeling, it was different now. The unease had grown into something deeper, something more primal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan the cabin made. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or an animal, but the longer I listened, the more it felt like something was trying to get in. The next day, I decided to leave. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I packed up my things quickly, ready to head back to civilization. But as I walked toward the door, I stopped. The air outside had changed. The stillness was gone, replaced by an eerie tension, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stepped out onto the porch, and then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. It was a man, tall, with ragged clothes, his face hidden in shadow. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But before I could react, the figure disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I grabbed my bag, jumped in the car, and drove away as fast as I could. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached the highway. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I finally calmed down enough to think clearly. What had I seen? Who was that man, and why had he been there? I couldn't explain it, but one thing was certain. I'd never go back to that cabin again. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I finally felt a sense of peace.